Only the Boskop man, Transvaal province, South Africa, was for a time considered as a Cro-Magnoid, having affinities with the Bushmen. But this opinion was later abandoned by its partisans. Cornevin, unfortunately, continues to confuse Grimaldi man, a Negroid, with marked prognathism and broad nose, with Cro-Magnon man, who is not at all prognathous, but presents in hypertrophic fashion typical European traits: thin lips, prominent chin, narrow nose. There is reason to re-examine the documents. The theory that makes Caucasoids of the Dinka, Nuer, Maasai, etc. is the most unwarranted. Suppose an African ethnologist insisted on recognizing only blonde Scandinavians as whites and systematically refused all other Europeans, especially Mediterraneans, French, Italians, Greeks, Spaniards, and Portuguese, membership in the white race. Just as Scandinavians and Mediterraneans must be considered as the two poles, the two extremes of the same anthropological reality, it would only be fair to do the same for the two extremes of the reality of the black world, Negroes of East Africa and those of West Africa. To call a Shilluk, a Dinka, or a Maasai a Caucasoid is as devoid of sense and scientific validity for an African as it would be for a European to claim that a Greek or a Latin are not white. The desperate search for a non-Negro solution sometimes leads to talk about a primitive stock that might not yet have assumed a differentiated black or white character, or to whitening Negroes such as a Maasai. All the human types found in Kenya from the Paleolithic to the end of the Neolithic are perfectly distinguishable as Negroes. Dr. Leakey, who has studied nearly all of them, knows this. He knows that all the skeletons that have fallen into his hands have nigritic proportions in the full sense of the word. He also is aware that the observation by Boulle and Valois on the floor of the nasal fossa is applicable to all the skulls that he has studied. One can understand why anthropologists are silent on these determining points. On the contrary, they readily expand on cranial measurements, for in this domain, except in extreme cases, it is harder to distinguish a Negro from a white. They admit, for example, that from the Paleolithic to our day Kenya, East Africa, and the Upper Nile have been inhabited by the same population, which has remained anthropologically unchanged, with the Maasai as one of the most authentic representative types. To the anthropologists, he is a very type of the undifferentiated Negro. Whenever they discuss the late appearance of the true Negro, we must remember that this is because they do not consider him as such, for he has been there since the beginning of time, since the Paleolithic. All the skull specimens considered non-Negroid following the measurements of Leakey and other anthropologists are really those of his archaeological forebears from whom he does not differ morphologically. Dr. Leakey and all the anthropologists will confirm this. If he were not a living reality, his skull would have come out whitened, or in any case denegrified by their measurements, with an orthognathous face held high, a thin nose, high forehead, etc. Even alive, he is not a Negro in the view of the so-called specialists, but the authentic type of the Nilo-Hamite. I invite the reader to verify this. He will simply find these facts confirmed. Anthropologists have invented the ingenious, convenient, fictional notion of the true Negro, which allows them to consider, if need be, all the real Negroes on Earth as fake Negroes, more or less approaching a kind of Platonic archetype, without ever attaining it. Thus, African history is full of Negroids, Hamites, semi-Hamites, Nilo-Hamitics, Ethiopoids, Sabians, even Caucasoids. Yet if one stuck strictly to scientific data and archaeological facts, the prototype of the white race would be sought in vain throughout the earliest years of present-day humanity. The Negro has been there from the beginning. For millennia, he was the only one in existence. Nevertheless, on the threshold of the historical epic, the scholar turns his back on him, raises questions about his genesis, and even speculates objectively about his tardy appearance. It is quite possible that the Negro type, the true Negro of the anthropologists, who now inhabits West and equatorial West Africa, has existed since 10,000 BC. Unfortunately, the conditions of the tropical soil do not readily permit the fossilization of bones, and it is hardly probable that interesting finds will be made. For a long time to come, this will leave the field open for any and all hypothesis concerning the populations of those regions. On carefully rereading Bowman and Westerman's Les Peuples et les Civilisations de l'Afrique, the only ethnological synthesis on Black Africa, Mr. Cornevin will realize that he is mistaken, and that Central and West Africa are inhabited almost exclusively by Eastern Hamites, if we are to accept the conclusions presented in that volume. The difference in the intellectual approach of the African and European researcher often causes these misunderstandings in the interpretation of facts and their relative importance. The scientific interest of the European scholar with regard to African data is essentially analytical, seeing things from the outside, often reluctant to synthesize. The European clings basically to explosive, more or less biased microanalysis of the facts, and constantly postpones ad infinitum the stage of synthesis. The African scholar distrusts this scientific activity, the aim of which seems to be the fragmentation of the collective historical African consciousness into minute facts and details. If the African anthropologist made a point of examining European races under the magnifying glass, he would be able to multiply them ad infinitum by grouping physiognomies into races and subraces as artificially as his European counterpart does with regard to Africa. He would in turn succeed in dissolving collective European reality into a fog of insignificant facts.